Hello and welcome to Business on the Wire. Even as the economy slowly emerges from a lockdown and begins to pick up the pieces of the disrepair we've seen in the last few weeks, big questions remain on how deep the pain will be, how fast a recovery could be for India, and really how much this process or these first few months have set us back by. What could the role of the Reserve Bank be? Is the government doing enough? There's so many questions at this point. And joining me now is a man who probably has the greatest depth of understanding on many of those issues because he's been at the forefront taking those decisions. Dr. C. Rangarajan is former Reserve Bank Governor. He was also part of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, and he joins me now to talk about what the road ahead looks like. Thank you so much, Dr. Rangarajan, for taking time out and speaking to us today. I want to start by talking about what your sense is really of the impact of this pandemic on the economy.
The economic crisis that we are facing today is very different from the economic crises that we have faced in the past. In recent memory, this is the first time that an economic crisis has been caused by a non-economic factor, which is a pandemic. All the previous economic crises, including the 2008-9, was caused by economic factors. The last one was caused by the excessive credit boom and the collapse of the financial system in the United States. In addition to the health impact of the coronavirus, the economic impact also comes from the actions that we have taken in order to prevent the spread of the virus, namely the lockdown. It is the lockdown which has severely affected the economic performance of the country. It has brought a standstill the entire production process. The economy has come to a grinding halt. So the immediate problem that we have is the near stoppage of production in the country, and the factors that flow out of it, like the impact on employment, the impact on many other things, the impact on revenues, the impact on the fiscal system, and so on. Therefore, in a sense, to assess the impact or the economic impact, we need to take note of two factors. One, what will be the extent of the lockdown? How long it will be there? And secondly, how quickly we can recover from that impact once the lockdown is lifted. That is the rate of recovery that we are talking about. The original idea was that perhaps the lockdown will be there for 1 month or 1.5 months. But now it is almost completed 2 months, and we really do not know how long it will continue in one form or the other. The second is that what will be the type of recovery that we can have. Many people have estimated it. Some people think that the rate of growth of the economy can be negative during 2021. Some others estimate it in slightly better performance. Therefore, as I said, it depends upon the recovery. Now, let us say that we write off the first quarter of 2021, and the growth will pick up only in the beginning of the quarter 2. Then I believe that the possibility of a small positive growth cannot be ruled out. I still believe that something like 1 to 2% growth rate in real terms during 2021 cannot be ruled out. But as I mentioned earlier, one has to be conscious of the fact that there are so many uncertainties. People talk about V-type recovery in the sense that once the lockdown is lifted, the recovery can be very short. But some people think the V recovery can be there for some time, and then perhaps it can flatten thereafter. Therefore, there are some sectors of the economy which may not be affected. For example, agriculture may have a good season this year because of the good rainfall that is being forecast. Similarly, public administration and the expenditures associated with public administration will remain high because of the healthcare and many other reasons. But there may be sectors like the hospitality sector, even the manufacturing sector, which may be affected very hard. Yes. Therefore, there are estimates, as I mentioned, from a negative growth rate during 2021 to positive growth rate. My own feeling is a small positive growth during 2021 is still possible.
Let me pick up on two of the points you raised, both in terms of the extent of the lockdown and the pace of the recovery. Part of the problem with the extent of the lockdown is that it is now very spotty across the country. There are parts of the country that still remain in a complete shutdown. There are parts that are resuming activity, but this has hit manufacturing because of the difficulty in moving raw material, transport, etc. The second point I wanted to raise was about the pace of the recovery. As you pointed out, sir, for the first time, it's a situation which is without the financial system, not within. In that sense, are there any parallels to look at or anything in history to draw from? The chief economic advisor keeps going back to the Spanish flu. Is that the best possible historical example?
Well, the historical examples that we have are not comparable to what is happening today. The Spanish flu had a very limited effect. But here is a virus whose origin itself is being doubted. Here is a virus whose impact is not very clear. And here is a virus for which there is no remedy. I mean, there is no drug which we know, which can be administered to counteract the impact of the virus. I really do not think so. I mean, we have to go back several centuries in order to really find out like the plague which was there in the Middle Ages and the later Middle Ages and its impact on the system. Therefore, I would say that the nature of the virus is such that we really do not know at what point it will completely phase out. Some people are thinking that it may take more than a year or even beyond a year for its full impact to go up. But certainly, we have to make a choice because this choice is being put in somewhat graphic terms by saying life versus livelihood, in the sense that one approach is really to stick to lockdown so that the virus doesn't spread and therefore there is no death because of the virus. Whereas the other view is that so long as we keep the lockdown, the livelihood of so many people is being affected, and therefore the choice is between these two. But I think we have done the lockdown for some time. It has been going on for more than 2 months. Therefore, the time has come to make as a combination of the two. Perhaps in very severely affected areas, probably we must continue with the lockdown. But in other areas, we must loosen the lockdown. And there is a compelling reason for the economic activity to pick up. Otherwise, we are running into a very serious problem. The problem of the migrant labor, for example, is really a consequence of the lockdown. There were push factors and pull factors. The push factor was that there was no job, therefore there was no income, and therefore the migrant worker wanted to go. And the other, of course, the pull factor, namely that they really wanted to be with their family at a time like this. Therefore, we really need to strike a balance and get to a situation in which that could be severe lockdown in some areas. As you said, patchy is the word. Therefore, in some areas where the problem is very severe, have lockdown. But in other areas, we should let the economy to start functioning. Then otherwise, we will have a very serious problem in terms of taking care of the people.
Mm. Dr. Rangarajan, I just want to come back to the point you made about growth and the fact that you still feel there is a possibility there can be a minor positive tick. The other problem that people have had in terms of putting out forecasts or estimates is this constant changing of the target or changing of the goalpost. I mean, in the last couple of months, we have had several reiterations of the growth. We've had several revisions of, previous quarters, which makes it extremely difficult at this point to really get a handle on where we are at in terms of growth, and hence what the damage or recovery might be from here on.
Yes, the fact of the matter is that apart from the virus and its impact, the economy has been slowing. I mean, it is against the background of a slow growth in the economy that we are talking about the impact of the virus. Therefore, in the last quarter of 2019-20, the virus impact was only very limited towards the end of March. But nevertheless, the rate of growth of the last quarter was only 3.1%, which clearly indicates that the underlying factors contributing to the slowdown in growth continue to operate. Nevertheless, I think because of the various measures that have been taken also, there should be a pickup. And the uncertainties now really rotate around the extent and the strength of the recovery. After all, there is pent-up demand. There is one important difference between, let us say, an economic crisis caused by floods or storm or cyclone and the economic crisis caused by a pandemic. There is no destruction of capacity here, unlike in the case of the floods or the cyclone. The productive capacity still remains. It is only a question of how much the demand will revive and how much the capacity can be utilized. I certainly think that there will be a certain pent-up demand once the lockdown is lifted, and therefore the recovery can be sharp in the next 2 quarters at least after the lockdown is lifted. And that is why I believe that the rate of growth can be positive, but a very low positive. These are all guesses. I mean, I don't think any one guess is better than any other guess, but one can only make clear what the assumptions are.
When we do emerge from the lockdown, Dr. Rangarajan, the sense seems to be that the thrust or the effort would have to be from the government via some kind of fiscal stimulus to really get growth back on track. And on that parameter, the observation is that India has come short compared to its peers. On the monetary side, some action has been taken. Now, these are both ships that you have steered. You've been, heading the ship at the Reserve Bank of India. You've been part of the PM Economic Advisory Council. What do you think the best combination for India is? And do you think we're doing enough on that count?
Well, I think this is something that one must keep changing and revising as we go along. Let us look at the fisc, for example. The original fiscal deficit for 2021, as indicated in the budget, was 3.5% of the GDP. Now, we know very well that the revenues will not grow at the rate at which they were expected to grow in the budget. The revenue projections in the budget for 2021 were made on the assumption that the nominal income of the country will grow at 10%. The nominal income growth is nowhere going to be near that, because some people are talking, as I said, a real growth of minus 4%. Therefore, even with some increase in the prices, under those assumptions, there will be no increase in nominal growth at all. But whereas if you assume a positive, even a small positive growth with inflation, it could be around 4 to 5% or 6% growth rate. Therefore, the nominal income growth will be much less than what has been indicated in the budget. Therefore, the revenue shortfall is going to be very high. Therefore, this fiscal deficit of 3.5% of the GDP will not hold. In fact, they have already announced an increase in the borrowing program. Therefore, if you take into account the increase in the borrowing program, which has already been announced, this fiscal deficit will become from 3.5% of the GDP to almost 6% of the GDP. Now, this is without any change in the expenditure pattern. Even if you have to maintain the expenditures at the budgeted level, the fiscal deficit of 2021 for the center will be somewhere around 6% of the GDP. Now look at the states. They've all projected something like 3% of the state domestic product as the deficit. They have all been given now, subject to certain conditions, an increase in the borrowing program by 2% of the SDP. I think most of the state governments will use that because they are all in need of resources, because the brunt of the program, the brunt of the action is being borne by the state government. Therefore, what do we get already? We get already over 11% of the GDP. Now, even if the center increases the fiscal expenditure, even people admit that even this current program includes about 1% or 1.5% of the GDP as a fiscal expenditure. Therefore, we are essentially talking about a 12% of the GDP as a fiscal deficit. I think this is by itself a very large magnitude of fiscal action. Therefore, I certainly believe that in order to revive the demand, more expenditures are required. But what we should really do is let the expenditures happen and see how the fiscal deficit will move. There is a possibility of the fiscal deficit going beyond what I have mentioned. Then, in which case, the resources are not available to meet that fiscal deficit, and that will lead to some other problem which you mentioned about where the RBI will come into the picture. Now, two things in reply to your question, I must also add that in terms of stimulus, what role has the financial system to play? Given this particular situation of kickstarting the economy, there is the need for the banking and the financial system to come forward and provide the needed liquidity and the needed credit. The one thing that has been done in the measures that have been announced by the government has been the credit guarantee that has been given by the state, by the central government to the banks to the extent of, for example, in the MSME case, about 2 lakh crore. Now, this has a fiscal implication because a credit guarantee actually means if there is a default, the government must come in and pay it. It's a 100% credit guarantee. Therefore, it will be there. But perhaps that fiscal impact will not be felt during this year because that will happen only when the default happens. That may be next year or the following year. Therefore, there is a fiscal implication, but that fiscal implication is not transparent during the year. Therefore, activating the financial system to provide additional liquidity, to provide additional credit is a good thing. But there are certain cases in which, certain areas in which that direct help from the center to those sectors may be needed. Therefore, I'm not saying that whatever has been done is completely okay. That's not the approach. What I'm saying is what is already being contemplated takes you to a fiscal deficit of center and states taken together to 12% of GDP. That is nearly double of what is a mandated level. Therefore, you really have to see how to manage that. Second, I would say that as the economy moves, if there is additional expenditure required, then the government must come forward and do it. Let me say one more thing and then come back to the doubts that you may have in your mind. The other thing is that there are some expenditures which are a must. Healthcare expenditures are a must. You can't let the virus overtake us. Equally important are the expenditures to take care of people who have been directly affected by the lockdown, like the migrant workers. As I have written elsewhere, hunger needs to be fought as vigorously as the virus. Therefore, you cannot let the people to suffer. Therefore, these are expenditures which are a must, and the government must come forward and provide the necessary support. As far as the further stimulus is required, what is needed is, let us do what can be possible out of the elevated level of fiscal deficit. And if it is required even more, the government should be willing to come forward to raise other resources. There are two possibilities. One is really net inflow of resources from abroad. If they can be increased, then there are the resources that are available with a view to expanding the expenditure. The second, of course, is the reliance on the Reserve Bank. I will come to it. You may have some questions on that. I will respond to it.
That's the question I was coming to, actually, Dr. Rangarajan. I mean, the Reserve Bank has absorbed a large part of the revised borrowing already, but there have been a lot of clamors for direct monetization, debates around monetization. Where do you stand on that, and how effective a tool do you think it is in this situation?
Two things. One, as I mentioned, even the 12% fiscal deficit of center and states together cannot be met without the support of the RBI. Therefore, in one sense, I would say monetization of the debt is inevitable. I think some amount of monetization of the debt will have to be done. But there is also a point beyond which you cannot go. I mean, I think there is, while accepting the fact that extraordinary situations require extraordinary solutions, and therefore one should not stand too much on issues like monetization of debt. Please remember, I was the one who, as governor, put an end to the automatic monetization of the deficit. In 1994 to 1997, the agreement with the government of India, the earlier agreement, was revoked. So I have a certain interest in seeing that the issue of monetization of the debt is kept under review. But the point really is the certain amount of inevitable. The second one I want to say is that it is better to do indirect rather than direct, because direct monetization of debt would really mean that it is an agreement between the government and the RBI, and the market is out of it. But in the indirect, what happens is that the banks subscribe to the government paper, but the required liquidity is provided by the Reserve Bank. Therefore, some reflection of the market signals get or seen, and therefore it is a better thing to do it. But in either case, the ultimate source of liquidity is the Reserve Bank. Therefore, I would answer your question by saying monetization of debt is inevitable. Some amount of monetization will become absolutely necessary. But one has to take into account whether any spurge or any strong inflationary consequence is seen or not. If it is not, then I think further monetization may be possible. Therefore, we need to, as I say, the old saying, crossing the river by testing your pebbles or whatever it is, or the Chinese proverb. So what we really have to do is, yes, We have to accept the fact that given this situation, monetization of debt is inevitable. But we should go along with it step by step in a measured way, so that we do not invoke inflationary fire. That can happen, not this year, next year. Please remember that is what happened in 2008-9 later on. The fiscal deficit of central government went up to 6% of the GDP, and later on in 2010-11 and so on, we had this high level of inflation. We need to keep this in mind, but to repeat what I have said, monetization of debt in one way or the other has become a necessity.
Finally, Dr. Rangarajan, I want to take you back to 2014 when a committee headed by you, set out the basis for determining poverty, and you came to a certain conclusion in terms of the figure as well, which at that point was just touching 30% of our total population. Given what this large migrant swath has lived through that we were talking about, do you think we need to reset the basis of determining poverty? And do you think this entire lockdown period has pushed a larger percentage of our population into poverty, both in the urban areas and in the rural as well?
Well, the committee to which you make a reference did come to the conclusion that in a modified way that the total the poverty ratio was almost 30% of the total population. But let me say that in the current case, what will happen is not very clear, because the people have been thrown out of employment, and therefore they have no income, and therefore the unemployment rate will be higher, and consequently the poverty ratio will go up. But the question is that will they come back? Is it a temporary blip in the scene, or is it something that is permanent? I think that is a question that we need to ask ourselves. I believe that if the recovery happens within this year itself, then the migrant labor who went home may come back. I understand, at least from Chennai, that there are indications already that some people are wanting to come back, and the entrepreneurs here are really sending out feelers to the people to come back, because they do realize that the local labor is not really adequate, or is not willing to do the kind of jobs that the migrant labor was doing. Therefore, I believe, yes, the impact of the virus, insofar as it has impacted the people in terms of their employment, will result in increase in the poverty ratio. Probably, if we do a survey this year, the poverty ratio will certainly go up. But this could be temporary. But I must mention one fundamental thing. If you look at the numbers on poverty, you will see that in periods in which the economic growth has been strong, the poverty ratio has come down. If you look at my report, or even look at the Tendulkar Committee report, you will find between the period of 2009-10 from 2000 to 11-12, that is the high growth period following 2005-6 to about 5 years, the poverty ratio did come down very, very substantially. Therefore, growth has an important impact on poverty ratio, and therefore, if the estimate is that the growth rate can be negative, or the growth rate can be only small positive, I'm quite sure that the poverty ratio this year will go down. I'm sorry, the poverty ratio will go up. The number of people under the poverty line will increase. But if growth picks up next year, then this can be a temporary phenomenon. Therefore, the whole question depends upon whether the economy finally turns around and the rate of growth picks up and we get out of the slow growth phase.
I want to close with a question which some international observers have made, Dr. Rangarajan. It doesn't paint India in a good light, but I want to know your thoughts because you have far greater depth of knowledge than many of us. Some people have observed that in the last 2 decades, India basically pushed really hard to get its growth up and to get that to become a headline figure. And in the process, perhaps ignored development as a core objective. And at this point, given what we've seen over the last few years and our serial slippage of growth in the last 8 quarters, we have now squandered both. We have neither growth nor did we do enough for development, which is why we have such gaping holes in health infrastructure. Would you agree with that criticism?
No, I don't think that we overlook the development goals. As I just now mentioned to you, that the argument has been that a strong economic growth has a favorable effect upon many dimensions. A strong economic growth leads to a reduction in the poverty ratio because, in some sense, the strong growth is felt all along the strata of among all the strata of the society. In fact, when we are growing at 3.5% per annum, this impact could not be felt. But when the economy really grows at 7 to 8% or 8%, 8 to 9%, then the per capita income begins to grow at about 7% or something, 6 to 7%. That is a strong growth. If that happens, then the poverty gets reduced. Also, another thing, that when the economy grows stronger, that is a time at which the government is also able to raise more resources. And that is a time at which more social safety nets could be built into the system. Please remember, it is in the period of post-2005-6 and 2012-13 that we introduced many of the important programs like the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, the Extended Food Security. All these could be introduced only because the economy was growing strong and the government could raise the resources in order to be able to provide the social safety nets. Therefore, I would certainly say that growth is important, but growth by itself does not do all of that. Growth has to be supported by a policy which also aims at improving the social dimensions of the economy. But growth enables you, if the government is broad-minded, to do that. Therefore, I personally think that a strong growth with a commitment for social equity is the right answer to the problem. I will only conclude by saying that certainly the COVID-19 has many lessons for us. I think there are 2 areas in which that we really have to learn. One is in the area of healthcare. Yeah. I think our healthcare system has seen to be very defective in the context of the crisis. We need to have a decentralized system. We need to have a public health system, public medical system, which is much broader. I think we need to act on that. That is one thing. And the second is essentially a proposition that you have said, namely that we really need to look at the vulnerable people and the weaker people. We really need to strengthen this system of social safety nets. But for all of that, I will also once again emphasize, we need strong growth. You can't neglect that. Therefore, you really need to, if I may say so, walk on 2 legs. One is growth and the other is the social improvement. If you ignore any one leg, then country will only start limping. We need to strengthen both links.
And we have never needed it more than we do at this point. Dr. Rangarajan, thank you so much. I so appreciate your time and thoughts today. Thank you very much for joining in and talking to me.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I enjoyed it. Okay.